I'm going to show you the easiest way to take a spore print and turn it into a spore syringe at home, starting with mushrooms from my most recent harvest. Now, this process is pretty simple, but there's one important thing to understand. Even when we use sterile water, sterile tools, and work as cleanly as possible, we still don't want to treat spore syringes like they're guaranteed clean, because the reality is spores can and likely are still carrying contaminants. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to collect a spore print, turn part of that print into a syringe, store it properly, and what I like to do before trusting it with my grow. But before we get into any of that, we need to collect some spores from our mushrooms. This process pretty much remains the same for all mushrooms that drop spores from gills, and it really all begins with choosing the right mushroom. We want to select mushrooms that are mature enough to be dropping spores, but not so old that they're dried out, slimy, or starting to crack and fall apart. I like to choose the healthiest looking mushrooms in my monotub, obviously. To verify maturity, I look for torn veils and flattening caps. That's the mushroom's way of telling me that it's mature and ready to drop some spores. Once I find some mushrooms that I like, I'm going to remove the cap and place them gill side down on a clean piece of foil. You can wipe the foil down with 70% isopropyl alcohol first if you want for extra cleanliness. Just make sure it fully dries before placing the caps down. With the caps on the foil, I'll cover them with a container to hold in a little bit of humidity so they don't dry out before they have time to drop their spores. If you choose to skip this step and leave the caps uncovered, they may dry out too much and not really get a proper chance to drop as many spores as they otherwise could have. Once they're covered, I like to let them sit for several hours, or oftentimes even overnight. After several hours, if everything worked out okay, you should be able to lift up the cap and see a nice visible spore print on the foil. Now, one thing worth noting here is that the cap probably isn't done after the first print. Oftentimes, you can take that cap that just dropped a nice spore print, move it to a fresh piece of foil, and collect yet another great print. Any subsequent prints may be a little bit lighter than the first, but you should still be able to get a good amount of spores from each cap. Now, once we're satisfied with the amount of prints that we have on our foil, we want to let them dry before folding the foil up. The print itself is probably going to look dry pretty quickly, but there can be some remaining humidity and moisture on top of the foil, and we don't really want to trap that moisture inside of our folded foil because that's just going to be asking for contaminant problems down the road. So once I remove the caps, I'll just leave the foil somewhere protected until the surface looks fully dry. This usually takes an hour or two. Now, once the print is dry, I fold the foil over itself so the print is protected inside. Then you just want to make sure to label what it is and when you collected it, because one spore print is easy to remember, but once you have 5 or 10 different prints from different species, you'll never be able to keep track of what's what. Now, at this point, I could just store the print or scrape some spores onto agar. So the question here becomes, why bother turning it into a syringe at all? The main reason to make a syringe is because it allows the spores to be more easily used later on. A spore print is super useful, but every time I want to use it, I have to open up the foil, scrape a little bit off, and expose the print yet again. By turning a small piece of that print into a syringe, I can keep the original print folded up, store the syringe in the fridge, and use a drop or two at a time across multiple agar plates. It really comes down to convenience, simplicity, and margin for error. Just remember, turning spores into a syringe does not instantly make them cleaner. It just makes them easier to work with. And that's why I still wouldn't inject a homemade spore syringe straight into grain jars or bags. With a spore syringe, I would first test some on agar, clean up anything that's needed, and then go from there. Now, we're basically ready to make the syringe, but first we need to sterilize a couple things and just get our equipment prepared. As always with mushroom growing, cleanliness is what's going to separate our grow from failure, so you're going to want to pay attention here. Here, I'm going to prepare some distilled water, some mason jars, and a scalpel. I'll fill one of my half-pint mason jars with distilled water and put the lid on, but make sure you leave it loose. Then I'll cover the lid with some foil, take my emptied jar and scalpel, and wrap them up in foil too. Now my scalpel blades are sterile, which is why you don't see a blade on the scalpel here. All of this will get loaded into my Instant Pot and sterilized for 45 minutes. Now, for the actual making of the syringe, we need some way to control the air around us. For that transfer, I'll be working in front of a laminar flow hood, but you can also do this in a steel airbox, which is a much cheaper option. And as always, if you want to check out any of the gear I'm using here today, I'm going to have everything linked down below. Now, with our prep work done, we can finally make the syringe. Working in front of my laminar flow hood, I'm going to open the spore print from earlier and scrape a small section loose with my scalpel. Spores are absolutely tiny, so if I can see even a small portion of the print come off that foil, that already represents a huge number of spores. And I'm not talking about dozens or even hundreds. A visible speck could easily contain thousands or even hundreds of thousands of spores. Now, more spores does not automatically mean better. At a certain point, you're mostly just making the syringe darker, clumpier, and wasting the rest of your print. So after scraping some spores loose, I'll sprinkle them into my empty mason jar. Then I'll pull some sterile water into my syringe, inject that into the jar with the spores, mix it up a bit, and then draw it back up into my syringe. I like to push and pull the spores in and out of the syringe a couple times in an effort to break up any clumps that may be there. Though that step is voluntary, it's probably not going to make or break the success of your syringe. Now at first, it might look like nothing happened, but once you hold your syringe up to the light, you should be able to see tiny particles floating around inside the syringe. And that, my friend, is the spore solution. It's hard to see it on camera, so I filled a separate syringe with just plain water, and you can definitely see the syringe with the spores is a bit darker. A tiny piece of the spore print is now suspended in 10 milliliters of water, and the rest of the print can still be saved for later or used to make some more syringes before putting it away. Now before I store this syringe, I'm gonna make sure I label it. Just like with the spore prints earlier, if you only have one syringe, labeling might not seem like a big deal, but once you have a few, they all start looking exactly the same, and you're really going to be frustrated that you didn't take the time to label these. So I just print my little label and put it on the syringe, or if I'm making multiple syringes, I'll just label the bag that I'm putting all the syringes in, and then I'm going to store it in the fridge. The lower temperature helps keep everything dormant until I'm ready to use it. And when I do use it, once again, my first stop is going to be to agar, not grain, because if anything unwanted made its way into the syringe, agar gives me the chance to catch it early instead of finding out weeks later when an entire grain jar goes bad. And that's the easiest way I know of to collect a spore print and turn it into a syringe. The process itself is fairly simple, but the real use case matters. A spore syringe is not a guaranteed clean shortcut. It's not a replacement for liquid culture. It's just a practical way to store spores and keep them ready for later. Now, if you're ready to test this syringe out on some agar, but you're not quite sure how to pour agar plates, I'd check out this video next right here where I show the easiest way to make agar plates at home. That's it for today. Thanks for watching and happy growing.